Throughout its 50-year existence, the Father Panic Village, known previously as the Yellow Mill Village, provided a home and community for upwards of 50,000 people. When the construction for the village was completed in 1939, the complex allowed for a solution to slum concerns and crime in Bridgeport's east side. For a quarter of a century, the village fulfilled its goal of providing affordable and modern housing for the people of Bridgeport.
However, the village is more widely known for its decline and nightmarish events that took place in the 70s throughout the 80s.
Located in the east side of Bridgeport, the Father Panic Village was a 40-acre public housing facility made up of 42 flat-roof, high-rise buildings. It was the first public housing complex in New England and the sixth largest facility in the U.S. In total, the buildings had enough space for around 1,128 families. The Father Panic Village was a place of hope for the lower class who couldn't afford to live in any other housing. This was all thanks to Father Panic himself. In 1916, he immigrated to the U.S. After living and working as a Roman Catholic priest in Bridgeport, he became involved in public housing. After seeing firsthand the plight of those dwelling in substandard houses around his church, he sought only to improve the living conditions by giving them a decent place to live. While working at the Bridgeport Housing Authority, he was famously quoted by saying, "No sermon is more effective than to take the poor people out of the dirt and filth and place them into the sunshine."
So I would say, what attracted people to Bridgeport, back in the 1940s when Father Panic was built, and you had a huge migration from the south of African Americans that were coming to Bridgeport because there was a lot of industry here, so there were jobs. And so partly Father Panic was built to get rid of the slums and to attract working class families to come here to work in the factories, and that worked well for the 40s and the 50s. And then what happened was that migration kept coming in the 60s and 70s, and all of a sudden the manufacturing jobs were drying up. So they would get here, they may have gotten a job, and then they would get laid off. And so the housing was here, and the housing at that point in time was maybe 10, 20 years old, so it was still in very good shape. And it was a wonderful place to live because you had working families, people with jobs who could walk to their place of employment. There was retail along the retail strips. And so I think at that point in time, it was a very viable place and a happy place to live. And a lot of our residents have told us, I lived at Father Panic back in 1955, and it was a safe place. You could leave your doors unlocked. Everybody knew everybody else.
For the village's first 30 years, it was a place where middle-class families wanted to live. It was a place that was walking distance to the industrial factories for the parents, and the spaces between the buildings were covered in grass, with playgrounds and safe places for the children to play outside. To many families, it was the closest thing to a white picket fence house that they've dreamed of. The $19 rent per month was enough to pay for heat and electricity and also included plumbing. The Father Panic Village provided an affordable home where middle-class families could stay and get back on their feet. Tenants that lived in the village before the 1960s raved about the community feel that was present. The man pictured here was simply known as the Vegetable Man, who drove his truck around delivering fresh vegetables to the community. However, in the beginning of the 1960s, life in the village started to change. The people in charge of the village decided that they needed to modernize the village, so they started replacing grass with asphalt, removing doors and door frames to main entrances so that doors could not be installed, removing parapet walls from roofs, and improperly installing roofs so that cracks were caused. These were the cheaper options. However, they did not work out in the long run. Also, the way the buildings were set up allowed for people to run in and out the villages with ease, making the land a very hard place for the police to control.
And then the second thing that hit back in the 60s was this concern by the federal government that we weren't serving the most neediest of people. So people were losing their jobs. There was something called a flat rent or a ceiling rent, which was the amount of funds that it cost to operate that unit. So let's hypothetically say it was $200 back in 1965 for a 2-bedroom unit. That was fine if you were a working class family, but what if you just lost your job? Now you're going to lose your place of where you live because you're not going to be able to afford that. And so the government said, not to worry, we're going to change the rules of public housing, and they did so under the Brooke Amendment. Brooke Amendment Act of 1968 said nobody has to pay more than 25% of their income. And so if your income was zero, you paid zero.
Yeah.
And if your income was $100 a month, then you paid $25 a month. But what that did to public housing was it created an unequal balance sheet. All of a sudden, it cost $250 to operate that unit on a monthly basis. But now the amount of money coming in from rent was all over the place. Some of it was $250, some of it was zero, some of it was $50. And so all of a sudden you have a gap in terms of keeping those and maintaining those units and keeping them in good repair. People who had the ability to move out moved. And so what happened behind them, there was a vacuum in public housing and vacant units. And people coming in again from the South who perhaps didn't have a job came in, found out that there was housing available for them, and they settled in. But they couldn't find a job. And so now you have that imbalance again of not enough people with a real working salary to be able to support the project, and a huge influx of people that couldn't find employment when they came here and ended up staying in the projects because it was the housing of last resort. You don't have to have an income. I can stay here and pay zero rent. And then the policies were, you have to declare your rent, but you can earn money under the table. There's an underground economy that you don't have to show how much money that you're making if you're just being paid cash. And I would say probably 50% of the public housing residents who show no income when they go in to get what's called recertified every year obviously aren't living on no income. You've got to buy food, you've got to buy clothing, you have expenses. There is an underground economy. The 60s and the 70s come, you've got this huge influx still coming up from the South thinking that there are jobs here, and they're no longer jobs, but their families are up here. No jobs, no way to employ themselves, so a lot of people turn to crime to support themselves. And with that came the drug and the gangs. And that's what really destroyed Father Panic.
A group of 4 buildings were known as the Hole. They became a center for the drug trade. Father Panic Village had hit rock bottom. At this time, 4 or 5 homicides occurred each year. For these reasons, neighbors barricaded themselves in their apartments, and some even wore bulletproof vests. The sound of gunshots became a regular occurrence in the village. During its final years, people didn't respect the village as much as they did before. The people living here were on welfare, and they did not care as much for the buildings because most of them were barely paying anything for rent. They did not see it as their own property, but rather the property of the state that they didn't need to worry about. The buildings started to deteriorate. More and more, the buildings started to look like a slum. According to many residents, the living conditions became very poor. During this time, some policemen were afraid to go into the village.
In 1986, the city leveled all but 15 buildings. This extreme decision-making was the only option to find the end of a very corrupt, drugged, and dangerous tunnel. A majority of the residents were forced to leave.
In 1990, the demolition process was complete, and the final 9 buildings came down. The Father Panic Village was no more. Today, these elementary school students walk by the village every day after school. Public housing is a tough thing to figure out, but we need to prevent events similar to what happened in the Father Panic Village from happening again.
From when its doors opened to the time the village saw its last days, the Father Panic Village has left a lasting impression on those who live there. There was always a strong sense of community and pride, no matter what race or religion. The people who lived here looked out for each other in good times, and others were bound by a spirit of survival during the village's more notorious